Welcome to the channel. Today, we're exploring some unbelievable story. Stay tuned and let's dive in. Clara turned to face me as she approached the door. Thanks, Ethan. Will I see you tomorrow? You bet. She stood on the tips of her toes and tenderly kissed my cheek. Her perfume lingered briefly as she whirled around and entered the hallway. I watched her hips bounce back and forth as she walked to the elevator. She was undeniably lovely. She turned and gave me a little wave before leaving. As soon as I snapped the door of my apartment closed, she's a little young for you, don't you think? I hesitated, peering at the back of the door, hoping for a second that there was a mirror nearby to see the expression on my own face. I waited, but it didn't arrive. Maybe it had finally ended. Perhaps I'd finally moved on. I looked for the fury, but it was not there. Well, she is young, Laura. I wouldn't know about the rest. I turned and went away without giving her a second look. I strolled inside my apartment and into the kitchen, feeling a sudden need for a drink. I opened the refrigerator to do a quick inventory. There were the fruits and vegetables I like, the chicken breast thawing for the supper I no longer wanted to prepare, yogurt, milk, energy drinks, and beer. I took one of the 7 bottles remaining in the case I had bought about a month ago. It was a long cry from the pace I had established in the first year after my divorce. I could hear her footsteps behind me, the click of her heels contrasting sharply with my bare feet. I opened the bottle and placed it on the barren stainless steel counter. I opened the cabinet door and disposed of the bottle cap precisely where it belonged. Everything was in its place, as it always had been ordered, nice and spotless. I made my way to the living area, passing through an imaginary line that divided the huge open spaces: kitchen, dining room, office, bedroom, gym, and living room. The furniture was all high-end yet never looked like a matched set. The living area was no exception, with 2 rigid black leather lounge chairs on one side, divided by a metal end table and a crystal light. The chocolate leather giant sofa came next, with a massive 60-inch LCD screen and a glass-topped oak coffee table. But the recliner was my favorite, plush, tan leather, big enough to hold my 64 frame, definitely comfortable enough to sleep in. Nothing matched, but nothing looked out of place. Each piece called to me when I purchased it, everything had a story, everything was me, so it fit. Everything except for her. Are you not even going to offer me a drink? It was the first time I really stopped to look at her. She showed up unannounced, and it was the first time I had seen her in 8 years. I was honest enough with myself to admit that she looked good, even beautiful, but then again, she always had the looks. It was her other qualities that I had trouble with. I don't want you to receive the sense that your presence is appreciated. You are not my guest. If you want something, you can look for it yourself. I watched her twist on her heels and walk back to the kitchen. I had missed her bum, it was wonderful. After all, she knew it too, which is why, as she was at the time, she always wore a skirt that screamed, "Yeah, I know you're looking." I allowed my eyes to wander from her sexy bum to her long-toned legs, to the straps around her ankles, to the 4-inch heels of what had to be her very expensive shoes, and I let my primal urges rule the moment, imagining her bending at the waist for my pleasure rather than to find whatever she was looking for. I was waiting for the longing to set in, a reminder of the pain and heartache that always came with being forced to look at something that wasn't yours anymore, something that had been taken, stolen, or lost, but what I felt instead was something entirely different, pride, perhaps more of a "yeah, I've screwed" that kind of moment. She returned, having located her distinctive wine glass and Chardonnay. Her eyes were serene, coolly masking her genuine intentions, and for the first time in my memory, that understanding did not terrify me. "You look good, Ethan." "I feel good, Laura." The chess battle had begun, and it felt fantastic not to have to defend straight away. "You aren't going to ask me why I'm here? You aren't even curious?" "I'm not saying I'm not intrigued. A person can never have enough information." Her telltale smile indicated that she believed we were on equal footing. "It's just that I don't give a..." Laura had an extraordinary ability to keep her poker face even in the most unexpected situations. I knew this personally, so it felt nice to witness her little triumph, even if it only lasted a second. She turned to face my 18-foot-long wall, which was covered with framed images of my trip and served as a floor-to-ceiling reminder of how I had arrived and the lessons I had learned. I had heard the term rock bottom, and although I had never experienced it, that is where I began, shortly after Laura divorced me and wrecked my life. I won't lie and say that ours was the perfect marriage, it wasn't. We struggled mightily in the beginning, mostly because we didn't have more than $20 extra between us at any given moment. Nonetheless, we were young, hopeful, impulsive, and committed, and our marriage didn't fail early on because we didn't believe it could. After all, soulmates never gave up on each other. So memories and moments were created, such as searching for loose change in the couch so that we could split a fast food meal and have enough left over to share a cupcake on our first anniversary, or the time we made our first New Year's Eve ornaments from paper and crayons and hung them on the fake tree that we found in the trash behind our apartment. Laura had them laminated before our second New Year's Eve, and I loved her even more for it. Laura had a habit of reorganizing things in a way that only made sense to her. She'd remove and replace all of the utensils in the kitchen, spices in the rack, and everything in the whole closet in a pattern that only made sense to her, and just when I'd gotten used to the new configuration, she'd do it again. It was a small thing, and it wouldn't have even been a thing if she hadn't. Hannah, where are the scissors in the drawer? Somewhere. They aren't where they were last week. Have you moved them? Probably. I can't recall. Just continue searching. They are here somewhere. I would often have to go out and purchase a replacement for whatever was missing if I needed it right away. It may take weeks for things to show up again, and we were poor, so any additional expense was an issue. It was a bit aggravating. Most of the time, I didn't think about our lack of money, probably because of the sex. She was as voracious as I was, and if we had 5 minutes alone, we were usually naked. I loved the sound of desperation in her voice when I was holding out on her. Then, after her arched bum fell back to the earth, I'd stare at her exhausted body and watch her while she recovered. Her body was young, soft, and voluptuous, an impossible combination, and I loved her looks. The one that announced long before her clothes came off that I was getting laid was my favorite. The sex was great, and I never got weary of her crystal blue eyes. Memories were what mattered most. After the dust had settled on our divorce and I had placed the cap back on the bottle, I had my first epiphany. Those hard years, when we never knew where the money for next month's rent would come from, showed me that together we could survive even the worst situation. Laura, on the other hand, saw them as a nightmare that she would never live again. The glass dangled in her fingers, the wine swirling to match the sway in her hips, as I watched her peruse my collection. Her eyes gave her away with double takes at the photographs of places we always said we'd visit together when our dreams were impossible but shared. She was the epitome of walking sexuality. When she turned her head to gaze up at the photos on the top row, her shoulder-length blonde hair hung over the shoulders of her silk shirt, revealing the soft sweeping lines of her neck, the same neck I had dreamt about strangling so many times. I suppose it's true, you actually went to all those places. I did. She was looking at me again, as if she was trying to predict my next move. Unfortunately for her, I didn't have one. You've changed. Oh, I doubt that's true. In fact, I know it isn't true. I am the same guy I always have been. Perhaps with a bit more me and much less you. See? That's what I mean. You would never have spoken something like that to me previously. Life is full of things we wish to say, intend to say, and see ourselves saying. We get lost in our quiet or lose the person we should be. Do we pretend to be someone we are not? I had spent a lot of time seeking for that answer, and I eventually determined that we attempt to be the person we believe we are until someone shows us our image in the mirror and we can no longer keep the deception. Some people handle the unexpected information better than others. Maybe that smirk had returned. I knew it. So what's changed now? You can't take any more of mine. We are not related in any way, therefore you can't harm me anymore. She began to speak with a lump in her throat. I wanted to think she was moved, but I didn't. Not even little. I want you to make it stop. I didn't start it, but you could end it. I'm not sure that is accurate, however. Even if I could, I am not sure I would. You're enjoying this? Not very. I'm not interested in being constantly reminded that the person I loved the most in the world was a dishonest, betraying woman. I'm not sure why. It's not like I said something she hadn't heard before, but I could tell it hurt this time, even if only little. Besides, I'm smarter now. Never interrupt your opponent when he is making a mistake. Sun Tzu. Napoleon I had been dreadfully unprepared for the complete destruction that had been heaped upon me during our first dispute. I was likewise unprepared this time, but happily, I was not alone. The rumors had started months earlier, and people were whispering everywhere I went. The economy was tanking, and a job, any job, was worth its weight in gold, and layoffs were on the horizon. Walking the factory floor was bad enough, with eyes following my every move, but people stopped me when they thought no one was looking and asked if I had seen the list. But at home, Laura was in a state of worry, asking me every day if I had heard anything, if I still had a job, if I was certain, what my strategy was, and what we were going to do. I didn't have a plan, I didn't need one. My employer was a nice guy, and he had my back. He had looked me in the eye and told me not to worry, so I didn't. And everything would have been fine if he had made the final choice and no one else had interfered. If there were any indicators, I missed them. Our sex life had taken a notable dive, and I assumed it was stress. I knew I wasn't in the mood as often as I had been before, and I think I felt it was more my fault than hers. Then there was the fact that Laura knew before I came into the home that I had been laid off, and my supervisor was taken aback when he informed me that the guy with the greatest team output and quality rating had been removed from his staff. Laura was not even surprised. Unfortunately, it wasn't my only long-term commitment that was going to go wrong. Laura went through the motions of a dutiful wife, with loving embraces, kisses on the cheek, keeping me well-fed, and the house spotless. She was much more of a homemaker during those last few weeks, and she never let me leave the room without telling me she loved me, most likely to mask her guilt. I was served while waiting in line for my time to use the company's outplacement services. When I returned home, the locks had been changed, my clothes had been boxed, and another copy of the restraining order was neatly placed on top. My severance package was supposed to last for months, but I was almost immediately forced to make a decision: should I use my remaining funds to fight the divorce and get custody of my daughter, or should I live? I opted to fight, but I was just outmatched. Lawyers, psychiatrists, and judges all came to the same conclusion: I was a psychologically abusive, unsuitable father, I was jobless and unable to care for a kid, and I was worthless. They declared so in paper, all legally. The ultimate blow came when I had my last crazed idea: if I could only talk to Ella face to face, she would listen to me. At the time, she was 9, old enough to tell them that she loved her father, wanted to see me, and that we were like peas in a pod. So I waited in the darkness behind the bushes, expecting to see her peering at what used to be my home. It was the first time I saw them all together, my wife, kid, and the company's VP of operations. He was the son of my previous company's founder, a womanizer and an ass, perhaps the worst business manager ever to occupy an executive position, but his father was revered, and people were loyal, and the only wrecked life was mine, and I was a nobody, as they all claimed. He was a strange-looking guy, 10 years my older, with a developing belly, a huge checkbook, and my pre-made family. I would be the first to confess that my description was influenced by my dislike. He wasn't deformed, but all I saw was ugliness. That was the night I had my first drink, not my first ever, but the first one I had to numb my agony. It was a lengthy drink that lasted a year, and it might have continued forever if I hadn't seen her again. I was strolling the streets, unshaven, unclean clothing, and a horrible stench that screamed my arrival long before I arrived. I was a couple of weeks away from becoming homeless, if you could call my decaying studio apartment in a practically condemned pre-war vintage building home. She was walking out of one of the midtown stores, bags dragging down her arms, looking through her luxury pocketbook for the keys to a premium coupe. I believe I scared her, in fact, I know I did. She was at a loss for what to do next: protect her things or her body. The intoxicated haze that kept me from seeing the actual world meant she was not in danger from me. It took me much too long to identify her, but that, oh my God, with her hands covering her mouth in amazement before she started her vehicle and sped away, eventually clicked. Several minutes later, I grabbed the beer bottle from the convenience shop, which was why I was looking for the bottle opener. I was too foolish to lift one with a twist-off top, and Laura had rearranged the kitchen tools for no apparent reason. I couldn't locate the bottle opener, but after smashing the bottle and dumping the contents of all but one drawer on the floor, I discovered it. There was no Laura, it wasn't our house, and the bottle opener was exactly where I left it, right where it should have been. Everything was in its place. I quit drinking that day and left my hometown the following day, armed with a rucksack containing all I had and almost $100. It wasn't difficult to quit. I wasn't an alcoholic. I was a damaged guy trying to hide in a bottle and failing. Is everything around you an inspiring quotation right now? Not usually. Not everything motivates people. Sometimes things are just a reminder of where we've been. What the heck, Ethan, what exactly does it mean? I have no idea what it means to you, but frankly, I have no interest in explaining what anything means to me, especially to you. I roamed for 16 months the first time, walking, hitchhiking, and catching the occasional bus. I took odd jobs till I had enough money to go on, but my eyes were open, and I set up camp wherever I found myself. There was always somewhere to rest my head, take a shower, and eat a meal. In an old, worn spiral-bound notebook, I jotted down everything I wanted to remember and everything I was feeling, creating a diary of pain and discovery. I bought a dozen books for the price of one movie and read them all. People loved to chat, and I was an excellent listener. I stayed up to speed on international affairs by reading newspapers that had been abandoned by others, even if they were frequently out of date. I bought a used digital camera from a pawn shop and took pictures to remember places I'd been, people I'd met, and, later, in my journey, things that had inspired me. Once a month, for around $10, one of the chain drugstores would transfer all of my pictures from my memory card to compact discs. After a year and a half, I lived in a dusty small town in the middle of the country. I worked my first post-divorce full-time job in the warehouse of a fertilizer business, hauling during the day and retiring to my rented room above the local garage at night to read and write. I exchanged my notebook for a used laptop and spent my free days at the local library, using their free internet to load my thoughts and pictures to a blog. People followed me and commented anonymously, and even though I was writing as a cathartic alternative to therapy, I liked knowing that people were interested in what I had to say. Laura paused at the only picture I had of my former family, a strip of photographs from a booth at an amusement park. Ella was 4 years old at the time, her ponytail wrapped in pink ribbons and her newly pierced ear shimmered with fake diamond studs. The overly bright flash couldn't compete with the smiles on the faces of the three subjects. Each captured the moment, the first surprised, the second silly, and then genuine laughter. I may help you contact her and reconnect. Oh, so you're up to date on all of your daughter's activities. I could see her searching my site for information. It must have been difficult for her, not having the upper hand, not being one step ahead, wondering what I knew or didn't know. You should be proud. She's turned out to be just like you. I noticed the astonishment in her eyes at that comment, something more, maybe regret, and she paused to look at that one as well. I suppose she was startled that the photos didn't match her memories, or maybe what she had been told. It's impossible to tell for sure since she didn't say anything. Despite the fact that I had never considered myself a writer, an online men's magazine recognized my blog as one of the best on the internet. In my previous job, I was a production supervisor for a large manufacturing company after my fourth promotion, and I had worked my way up from the bottom. It didn't stop them from offering me a monthly, then weekly column. The money wasn't great, but it opened doors. 2 years later, the email from the publishing company was a complete surprise. They wanted to see more of my work. They wanted to publish my book, which was non-existent at the time. I sent them an almost incoherent collection of essays. They sent me an editor who asked me to write an opening chapter about how my journey began. So I shared I thought it wasn't good enough, but I continued writing my blog. My column was becoming more famous and the money was improving somewhat, but I was bored, so I went again, this time for Europe. Despite the fact that there are no hostels for 35-year-old men and no reduced fare train tickets, I crisscrossed the continent as cheaply as I could. From Europe, I made my way to the Middle East, then India, and spent 3 months in Asia, experiencing the languages, culture, and food for the first time. I realized what it meant to be genuinely poor, not the pitiful excuse that I had cursed, but the people remained the same. People everywhere liked talking. I was 14 months into my current adventure and ready to return to the States when another email arrived with a preview of my book's cover attached. That's when things got interesting. I flew home to a host of agents, editors, publishers, and lawyers. With the increasing popularity of my column, there was a buzz about my book, and I turned that buzz into a fairly significant raise from the magazine, based mostly on a convoluted ad revenue formula. It was more than I had ever made before, and more than enough for me, so I returned to my hometown to start a new life in the place I had grown up, grown to love, and missed so much. Unfortunately, my book was released to an average response, a far cry from what some had hoped. To be honest, I wasn't really surprised. My rabid blog and column followers probably accounted for 99% of my sales. Unfortunately, the lackluster sales meant that my career as an author was most likely over before it even started. Then he went on TV and called my first chapter a load of falsehoods. A local reporter from my hometown asked the questions: was the tale in my book true? Had he seized my job, abducted my wife and children, and spread falsehoods about me in court? He could and should have said nothing, but he didn't. In most of the civilized world, the news didn't even raise a ripple, but in my community, the son of a rich businessman and the ex-wife of an author was a juicy tale. Whether out of shame or hubris, he overplayed his hand and sued me for libel and character defamation. It was all the publishing company needed. They had spent time and money vetting my book and even more on editing, design, production, and distribution, so when they saw an opportunity to recoup some of their money, they pounced, unleashing an army of expensive lawyers and public relations personnel on my former employer. I watched from the sidelines. It wasn't about him or me, it was about the controversy and the free publicity that came with it. His actions generated quite a commotion, and my book rocketed up the bestseller lists. It's weird how life works. Some individuals never learn to stop when they are ahead. Did you know the board requested his resignation? No, I had not heard. I am genuinely surprised he made it this far. Productivity fell 21% after his excellent cutbacks the first year and 18% the next year. Sales were down and morale was low. Your husband was never very good at running things. It didn't surprise me that she didn't rush to his defense. She'd never take a bullet for me. Why am I assuming you already knew? Because you are a cold, calculating, and heartless woman. It's really too bad, though, because from the papers I just signed for Olivia, I think he is going to need that paycheck. Was that your lawyer? She is not my anything, nor is she a lawyer. She is a paralegal. She works for the firm that represents my publisher. I try to assure you that it's not about me, while I'm clearly going to gain much. I guess karma is a witch. I could see the response churning behind her eyes. There were so many things she wanted to say and wished she could say, and I watched her eventually decide that there was nothing left in her tank, that I would have the upper hand in every situation. I hoped she'd let me use some of the one-liners I'd been itching to use, but I also prayed she'd leave me alone. So why are you here? This threw her off surprise, but she immediately recovered. Are you curious now? No, I just don't understand what it is that you think you can accomplish. I suppose you should be grateful that you love him so much that you're here trying to save the last bit of his crumbling empire, but like I said, it really isn't up to me. I measured her response, which was precisely what I anticipated. But you don't love him, right? It is his money. Oh, how ironic. He had everything, but now, in the most ironic of ironies, he'll have to give it to me, leaving you with nothing. What, you don't believe you can find another wealthy sugar daddy to defraud for money? I believe you are selling yourself short. You still have a gorgeous body. You'll fall on your feet, or, more likely, your back. It was not like that. I'm not sure I've ever laughed so hard in my life. She couldn't possibly believe it was different, but her body language was guarded, and her eyes told me she did. I was taken aback for a second, wondering if she didn't know. Oh my God, don't you know? What the heck does it mean? I didn't say anything for a while, quickly doing the mental math, but I couldn't find any pitfalls. After months of interviews, depositions, and discovery motions, it was all part of the record. If she didn't know, he had to know. She'd find out, and I wouldn't be hurting the case by telling her something that was soon to be public knowledge. You're correct, it wasn't like that at all. I am simply talking out of turn. It was all harmless, right? Yes, it was. I almost mumbled it and pondered asking her to repeat it, but I did not. Sure. He was just reaching out to his workers' families to ensure that everyone was aware of the situation at the facility and that everyone was, of course, prepared for the worst-case scenario. He was focusing his attention on the group's most vulnerable members' middle-level management. We were the most at danger, and he believed that his particular care was required. She listened intently, but I had no clue what she was thinking. So he asked you to lunch to give you the heads up? Of course. Nothing had been determined yet. Everything was merely preliminary. And every now and then, he'd phone you to give you an update on how the employee evaluation process was going. After a few more casual meals and phone conversations, he decided to shift his methods. He poured his heart out. The burden of knowing that his judgments will affect so many people's lives was just too much to handle. The things he had been given to preserve people's careers were horrifying: money and sexual favors. It must have been terrible for Laura. Her eyes were as big as I'd ever seen them. As I spoke, I moved over to my desk and looked for the appropriate file. Once discovered, I resumed my story. That's when you decided our destiny. That was the moment he won and I lost, the moment you put your confidence in me as a man, a parent, a spouse, and a provider, and it was overshadowed by your greed. That's when you gave him your body and ruined my whole life. I passed the papers over the table and she gazed down at them for a minute, as if they might burn her fingers if touched. I had never seen the lists and I had always assumed their existence was a myth, but my publisher's attorneys had combed through thousands of documents revealed during the discovery process, and the one she was holding was not particularly interesting, except that my name was at the top of the list of employees to retain. According to the dates, it was one of the earliest lists created, if not the first. The second list was significantly more fascinating. The names were the same, but the second list included Ryan Carter's somewhat nonsensical notes, check marks beside numerous names, and my name and one other struck out with a single red line. Mine was annotated with one word: Laura. There was just one other name marked that way, and the lawyers couldn't believe he had preserved it. But then, he was always an idiot. The third list was printed on his letterhead and labeled final, and, unsurprisingly, my name was no longer included. Her eyes flew back and forth in a mental question, which I'm sure yielded an answer she wouldn't believe. And now you're wondering how he could possibly know all that. She was gazing at me with her lips slightly open, which did not look good on her. You figure it out. You're dumb, but not too stupid. You understand what I mean. The want for another drink was strong, so I got up from my chair and walked into the kitchen, where I put a few ice cubes in a glass and placed it into the refrigerator opening to fill it with filtered water. If I'd learned anything, it was to never give in to my cravings. Decisions made after thorough preparation and consideration of the possible implications were more realistic, as was the fact that being intoxicated in the same room with Laura looked like a recipe for disaster. I believe that sex is one of the most beautiful, natural, awesome things that money can buy. Stephen Martin, since we're simply bringing everything out in the open, I suppose I'm intrigued. Have you ever loved me? Laura had been looking at the paperwork for almost 20 minutes. After about 5 minutes, I could feel her grasp tightening and her hands quivering, then a few minutes later, her perfectly stoic demeanor returned. She hadn't said anything else the whole time, so I decided to break the quiet. She didn't seem interested in answering my query, as she tilted her head just enough to catch my eyes before swiftly looking away. I would have paid more attention to Laura, but I couldn't understand why she was sitting in my loft. I had questions and needed answers, but I couldn't even go there since her abrupt entrance made no sense. In a world ruled by sharks, these guys were the killer whales. They didn't shy away from a fight, they wanted one, went looking for one, and did everything in their power to find one. It hadn't even been 48 hours since Mr. Moneypants' lawyers had requested a settlement conference, and my attorney and the attorneys for my publisher had thrown an impromptu celebration that night. Victory wasn't enough. Having been on the other side of the table with only righteousness on my side and getting my ass crushed had not been a fun experience, so yeah, I could have easily and correctly been labeled a hypocrite, but I hadn't started down this path, so I happily went along for the ride. I am certain that none of them had read my book. I was buried in those thoughts when I took another long look at Laura. She was as gorgeous as she had ever been, and I grinned at the notion that I had been right all along. I had always told her that she would only become hotter with age. I honestly had no clue why she had gotten all dolled up for me. She looked like she was ready for a night on the town, or more appropriately, a night on the hunt. And then it struck me. Holy shit, he sent you here. I'm not sure I'd ever seen Laura so angry. In fact, I'm not sure. When we were married, even during our most heated disagreements, she was never angry, disappointed, sure, irritated, yes, and terrified, more than I had realized. It was the main reason her cheating was so devastating. Laura's abandonment of me would have been a continent away in an ocean of improbable outcomes, with wave after wave crashing to the shore in my mind. Even now, after years of self-examination and a disciplined and sustained rebuilding of my confidence, I knew I would never be the same. Soulmates never give up on each other, but mine did. In the end, the Sharks believed that the judge would award nearly $6 million in judgments, despite the fact that my book, Property, had a valuation, and his lawsuit had been frivolous and without merit. They had amassed a mountain of evidence to prove that he and his lawyer knew that the only thing that made sense was that the person with the better argument would win. His mistake would not leave him penniless, but it would be dangerously close, and without a source of income, such as the well-paying job he had previously been given, the outcome would be disastrous. He had sent her to stop me in one last effort to rescue the one thing that really mattered to him, money. Laura looked up but did not respond. I knew she had no idea what I was talking about. I had to admire Ryan Carter's ability to keep her in the dark. I had never been able to keep even the smallest secret from her, mostly because the guilt would have eaten me alive. I guess conscience wasn't one of Ryan Carter's concerns. A few members of the board of directors began questioning him. Why didn't he have a family? When was he going to stop with the long list of women and partying? It wasn't that they cared about him or the women, for that matter, but it had the potential to be problematic for the company. You can't have your next CEO caught up in a sex scandal, it's bad for business. He just asked Victoria Clark to marry him, for the money. Of course, she was hounding him for money, so he presumably assumed she'd just say yes. Stephanie was what most people would call a gold digger, or at least that was the rumor around the plant, and her husband David was what I called a laughable idiot. I never had any first-hand knowledge of their exploits, but I had heard the stories. Most of the time, rumors are just that, but in their case, I had always believed they might be true. Victoria Clark was always the woman showing a little too much skin, wearing an outfit that was just a little inappropriate, and saying something that could easily have meant something much, much different. Her husband was always the guy talking about how hot his wife was, trying to get guys to admit they were checking her out. I always thought she was fairly attractive for a former daytime dancer. Of course, the contents of her CV may have been just a rumor, but what would have been ludicrous rumors about anybody else looked realistic for them. One-night stands, wild house parties, swinging, pictures and videos on the internet. I had no idea if any of those things were true, but I did know for certain that Nathan Scott was the other name crossed off the infamous list, right next to Stephanie's, and David had mysteriously vanished immediately following his termination. Also, while I had always thought she was a rather ditzy bleached blonde, she obviously wasn't as stupid as she frequently seemed, and she had the gift of tax documents to show it, 3 years' worth. He paid her about $120,000 for the twice-a-week treatments. Stephanie, who went by Steffi, had spilled the beans on Davis' little seduction ploy, and she made no bones about banging him for money. We had an agreement. He was generous with his presence, and I tried to express my gratitude every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon in the apartment he rented for me. My husband and I appreciated his presence, but as soon as Davey completed nursing school and returned home, I ditched that big prick and his small thing. She also had little trouble explaining why he continued to work part-time for years after marrying Laura. I glanced squarely at Laura as I concluded my next sentence. Apparently, he was looking for something he couldn't get at home. I wasn't sure Stephanie was speaking the truth until I saw Laura's eyes, and then I knew for sure. Of course, she may be making it up, since that doesn't seem like the lady I married. I could tell she was ready to lose it, and it had been about an hour since she had even made a sound, so I determined that if I was ever going to get my pound of flesh, it had better be soon. So, what did he say when he sent you here? He told me to get you to stop the lawsuits by any means necessary. Does he pimp you out often, or just when he is about to lose his fortune? He is not my pimp. He is my husband. Look, no judgment here. I've seen personally what that tight, tiny body of yours can do to men. It leads you to think things that are just not true. So, when will we get to the by any means necessary segment of the show? Because, to be honest, the persuasive argument section has grown quite monotonous. What will it take? She said it with such a lack of conviction. It was the only time I allowed myself to feel even the smallest amount of sorrow for her. How could someone so beautiful, so full of life, so energetic have such a lack of self-confidence? How could that person let themselves be used in such a way for money? It was just beyond my comprehension. Honestly, I understood the appeal at least a little. My favorite chair had cost me well over $10,000 when we furnished our first apartment, so yeah, it was extravagant, but it was also comfortable. Still, there was no doubt in my mind that I would trade every one of my extravagances to have just one more day alone with Laura in our dumpy little first apartment to keep things the way they were. As I already said, even if I could, I would not stop it. I believe you should go home to your spouse and tell him I'm not interested in his offer. Take your skanky buttocks back to him, get together, and discuss how you're going to get through this difficult time in your life. I am certain that with a love as strong as yours, you will make it through. I observed her gorgeous lips that I longed to kiss, her exquisite silk shirt peeling away from her magnificent neckline, showing only a hint of her extremely thin and undoubtedly equally costly underwear. It took all of my willpower not to have sex with her. After all, soulmates never give up on one another. I waited for the tear, but it never came. Sure, the water had accumulated in her eyes and I was afraid she'd let it spill over, but she didn't, so I had to give her credit for that. Get the hell out of my house and don't ever bring your cheating ass back. Sex without love is meaningless. But, in terms of useless experiences, it's really darn excellent. Woody Allen. Our conversation had lasted a couple of hours, but I hadn't planned on screwing her. To be honest, I hadn't given it much thought at all. The weeks leading up to that night had been full of surprises, but she was beautiful, and I was a man, and she did make an offer. What should a female do to obtain a refill around here? I grabbed her glass, stepped into the kitchen, refilled it with her preferred wine, and returned with her glass and bottle. I read your book twice. I would have responded with a witty comment or a sincere thank you if I hadn't been mesmerized by the sight in front of me. I would have had a better chance of finding my words if I hadn't been wondering what had happened to her blouse. Feeling a little sorry for myself because I had missed a disappearing act, fortunately, I was able to watch as she removed her skirt. I couldn't help but wonder if all those adventures, all that self-discovery, if all that. She continued to stand there in her virtually transparent black lingerie, see-through material, as proved minutes later when she reached behind her back with one hand and, in a practiced gesture, removed her garments. I've been heard that exploration will improve your sexual abilities. Pretty impressive. Oh, I have no doubt. We made love, and then I dropped weary into her. Her delicate fingertips tracing my lower back jolted me awake from my lovely sleep. Jesus Christ, Ethan, your ex was an idiot. Oh, Olivia, you say the sweetest things. The best revenge is to live on and prove yourself. Eddie Vedder. Olivia stayed with me every night for the next 5 months while the judgments wound their way through probate court. We had sex like newlyweds during her entire stay, though she always said, no matter how spectacular the sex was, she was going back to San Francisco as soon as the lawsuits were over. I didn't begrudge her in any way. Maybe sharks with only a few hours of law school left don't hang around the shallow end of the pool no matter how many times they come on. Why still, the time I spent with her, however short, was incredible. The first night we were together, she was at my apartment detailing the newest lawsuit, the one from my daughter, who was fighting me to safeguard her inheritance. I can't claim with any confidence that I didn't realize Laura was upset when she left that night, furious, even, but I can say that I honestly felt she was outraged at me, maybe for rejecting her down or taking what she legitimately earned on her back. Apparently, I was mistaken. I can't fathom what it must have been like for him. I remember being distraught when Laura didn't select me when confronted with something as routine as a company restructuring, but the coroner's report was inconclusive. Laura shot him once in the tool, causing his femoral artery to be severed, and then she turned the gun on herself. He bled out quickly, but no one could say for certain if he lived long enough to know she would rather kill herself than have sex with him when he was poor. Ryan Carter may never have known. I can't imagine how it felt, but I hope he took a time to think about it. Anyway, I spent days being furious with Laura, not for myself, but for her kid, who needed her, no matter how twisted up she was. No, Ella hadn't given me any sign that she and Laura were close. In fact, she was probably the reverse. Nonetheless, she was a forlorn young girl, and the one and only time she had come to visit me, she didn't remember me, at least not the real me. That surprised me a lot. I thought she'd be old enough to remember, but memories can be replaced by lies if you hear them often enough. She clearly didn't believe me when I said that once, long ago, we were happy together as a family, and now there'd be no one left to confirm it. One photograph on a wall of hundreds couldn't, or didn't, change her view. She was bitter during Laura's burial, which I entirely understood, yet, months later, it seemed I was still enemy number one, with little possibility of altering her mind. When the verdict came down and her inheritance was all but gone, she ran out of the courthouse, narrowly avoiding a contempt charge for the profanity-laced diatribe she left in her wake. That was the last time I saw her, and I don't think I'll ever see her again. Maybe Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Carter didn't permanently poison her against me, and someday she'll know that she can always count on her father for help, or maybe she'll find herself out there in the big wide world, or maybe she'll find her soulmate, hopefully one who won't give up on her. The bond that one hoped would always be as fragile as the one between her mother and me. Thank you for watching. Do you believe soulmates can actually go on? Please share your ideas in the comments below and remember to like and subscribe.